Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hey everyone. This week we'll explore the exciting field of synthetic biology. This field combines biology, engineering, and computer science to design and construct new biological systems or modify existing ones for practical applications. In this episode, we'll delve into some of the innovative applications of synthetic biology, such as its role in pharmaceutical production, environmental solutions, along with agriculture and industrial applications, highlighting the vast potential of synthetic biology to transform various sectors. We'll also discuss the challenges to balance the immense potential of synthetic biology to solve global challenges and the risks associated with its development to ensure that its benefits are realized while minimizing unintended consequences. So, Patrick, are you ready for a pet woolly mouse?
Well, I can deal with a pet woolly mouse over a dinosaur, a T-Rex.
Yeah. We'll get there later, but I mean, it's the whole impetus for talking about this was this idea that they've sort of engineered and brought back a mouse version of the woolly mammoth. So it's we're living in interesting times.
Yes, we are. Yeah. So synthetic biology is kind of it's a big topic. There's lots to it, but we think about synthetic. The word synthetic, of course, is being we created it, right? So we take biology, and of course, we just improve on it,
like everything else we do.
Yeah. So we the definition here. Synthetic biology is the application of engineering principles to biology involving the design and construction of biological systems and devices, as well as the redesign of existing natural biological systems for useful purposes. And it combines biology, engineering, computer science to create DNA encoded parts and devices, machines, and organisms.
So is there an analogy here to this idea of like artificial intelligence? So when we're saying synthetic biology, could we say like artificial biology in some instances? Because we're always trying to like engineer something of our own. It's what's out there is not good enough. We're always sort of tinkering with it, as it were, right?
Yeah. And the idea behind these, this is a huge investment of resources to actually create something, right? Now, if we think about it, how do we create, synthetic things, right? There's like a 4-step process. The first step is you go through the design phase, right? And you use computational tools and AI and such, and you build these genetic constructs, right? After you come up with some great idea. So that's the first thing, I guess. And then you actually select some kind of what they call a chassis organization or a container, that will be manipulated. And then we've got, the donor DNA and how that's going to be manipulated and or new DNA created. So then you do the build. And when you build, you can take existing DNA, use CRISPR and cut out segments and merge new ones with, Gibson and Golden Gate and, basically take these fragments and do what they call anneal them together and, have these hundreds of feet long DNA strands. The other way is you actually create brand new DNA. That's called DNA synthesis. And of course, if you're a wise, scientist in molecular biology, you know exactly how to create a new DNA strand. Yeah. So, you've seen enough representations in the natural world. Why not create a brand new one, eh? So that's where we get into the engineering side. Then the next step, of course, is after you create it, you want to verify it, right? And there's lots of very complex ways of verifying things at a molecular level, a cellular level, your microscopy. There's cytometry, which is using light, for instance, to examine uh, the the actual product or the properties of the cells, or fluorescent markers. And the idea behind that, of course, is looking at the properties of what you created to see if it's exactly what you wanted to do. And there's also these what they call biochemical assays, which are all this hodgepodge of different methods of verification. You can, protein analysis and nucleic acid analysis, and cell-based assays and binding assays, all this fun stuff which we'll never do as a normal person. and of course, the idea is you want to collect, the information, collect data on how this new population responds to tests and all that, right? And then, of course, once you've given that the green light, then you look at scaling up, and scaling up is, well, it's in its own right. It's a huge challenge, because what you can do in a laboratory doesn't mean necessarily that you can create enterprise-wide and mass produce, right?
Well, make it, like you said, make it stable as well, and ensure that it can be, sort of used for many different applications in a sort of safe way, right? Last season, we did an episode called Life Finds a Way, which was really centered around genetic engineering. So today's topic is, I guess, in a way, sort of an extension of that, right? There's still an element of genetic engineering, which I guess in that case was more along the lines of sort of manipulating things that exist. But when we get into synthetic biology, we're sort of creating new things, right? There's this idea that we can grow new cells, right? New human cells. This idea that we could potentially like grow a new organ, for example.
Yeah.
This
brain.
was, yeah, some of us need that. But that's, in essence, then it's again sort of, dialing into that idea of playing God, right? And that was sort of a big theme that came out of the Life Finds a Way, and of course we tied it into like Jurassic Park and that type of thing. But it's sort of an extension of our human curiosity, right? And trying to break through into new realms, as it were.
Yeah, and we, just like every other session we have, we ran out of time. We couldn't cover everything, so we'll have another session to cover as much as we can.
And revisit too, right? Because that's one of the things we've done this season is sort of it's been, a certain amount of time has passed, and the pace that technology evolves, there's always new things coming out. So when we were searching for things, we saw this idea of the woolly mouse and de-extinction, and that naturally lended itself to synthetic biology, which is pretty interesting.
So since you opened the door on examples, let's start into that a little bit. Pharmaceutical. There's lots of examples there. Think of, specific drugs that are being created. Also think about vaccines, right? Specifically the COVID vaccines. Good example, right?
Yeah.
Then we get into environmental solutions. Really interesting work being done here, specifically around, engineering, right, of the environment and the atmosphere. So the idea of carbon fixation and methane fixation, and of course, even renewable energy. The idea of being able to grow a solution and have it feed upon, the atmosphere and sink, I should say, pull the carbon out of the atmosphere, pull the methane out of the atmosphere, and in effect, be able to then process and or store that out of harm's way, right? So lots of interesting work being done there. One of the things that looks really promising is the idea of sequestering carbon into soil microbes, trying to actually breaking it down and converting carbon into, stable organic matter like carbon and oxygen. So, that's the use of fungi and bacteria. Um, there's other investigations like high carbon sequestering trees and such, but I'm really concerned about the idea that you build something like that. It's a high, in its biomass, it stores all this carbon, but then when it dies, it releases it, right?
Hmm.
There's a cycle, right? So the idea being, okay, well, what are you going to do with that now, right? It's pulled all this carbon during its life, but now where does it go, right? So I think there has to be a lot of thought, or a lot more thought, put into the full cycle of life here, how everything interconnects, before we go muck around with individual components.
Yeah,
You
back
know,
to the idea of playing God, as it were, right? And that we have these different patterns of things that are natural, right? This is how
yeah,
these ecosystems work. If you ever, for those of us that haven't, studied for a long time, the idea of an ecosystem is that everything, there's sort of a balance to everything, right?
yeah, the
In that,
cycle.
yeah, certain things feed other things, and there's a natural order of things, as it were, right? And that's how you can even consider our whole planet to be an ecosystem, right? And sometimes people say, "Oh, why is that? Oh, that's terrible that this happens in nature, or this is cruel, or that type of thing." But everything within the ecosystem sort of serves its purpose. And sometimes it's a very small purpose, sometimes it's a large purpose. If you look at, man, humankind, we're part of the ecosystem. And, even before we get into like genetic engineering and synthetic biology, we've done a pretty good job at like disrupting the ecosystem, right? Of all the
Yeah,
different things we built and the different how we've changed the landscape of things and how we've polluted and how we've destroyed species, which maybe the synthetic biology will bring back some
yeah,
of those species, or like you said earlier, how about we work on not making species extinct, as it were, right? I think
yeah,
there's a certain number of the species that are going to become maybe naturally extinct, perhaps, right? If you go all the way back to prehistoric times, there was a lot of species that through one circumstance or another ended up becoming extinct. But if you look at the acceleration of of the number of species that man has managed to cause to be extinct, it's pretty striking. So I guess where I'm going with all that is if we start, as you would describe, mucking about with it, and we start disrupting the natural balance of things, or introducing new things, or unleashing the woolly mouse into ecosystems, what's going to happen there, right?
well, I think the ultimate epiphany is, I didn't think about that, right? And by the way, everything's out of sync now. Everything's blown up, right? Because of whatever change you made, and however small it was, you know. And that's we don't always. A lot of us have very large egos, and not a lot of understanding. So you have to be very careful with this type of stuff. Um, so let's jump into, case in point, let's go to agriculture, right? So one of the big things out there is GMO foods. We all know about genetically modified.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's going to raise your crop yields. Oh, it's going to reduce pesticide and disease, right? I've got some numbers here from 2014. 22% increase of yield. That is huge. No, it's not. I'm sorry. 22%. I'm sorry. That's not a lot. And pesticide. Oh, well, 8.2% reduction,
Mm-hmm.
right? Of pesticide damage. These numbers they don't make business sense, okay? When you really look at them, I mean, they're marginal, right? But
Yeah.
but this is made Monsanto extremely rich, right? And it's led to um, glyphosate, which is Roundup, being present in 80% of all U.S. Urine samples taken contain glyphosate in 2022. That was posted by the CDC.
Oh,
Right?
really?
He said 91% of pregnant women with, have glyphosate in their system, right? And there's a higher correlation of glyphosate for those who have preterm births, right? It's found in farm animals, right? The International Agency for Research on Cancer, they classified it as carcinogenic, right? And also it is also connected to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They've also verified that it disrupts gut bacteria and hormones. It's an endocrine disruptor, right? Argentina, they have a high glyphosate concentrations in their world drinking water, consistently over 10 parts per billion. They have basically they've classified this as a root cause of birth defects and hormonal disorders, right? And so let's look at what our protective agencies are doing about this. Well, the U.S. EPA, they set the safe limit to 700 parts per billion exposure, right? Compared to Europe, it's 0.1 parts per billion, right? To the point where Germany, UK, France, they're all exceeding that limit. And a number of European countries, like Germany, have outright banned the use of Roundup and glyphosate products, right? WHO, which is worldwide, they've got it at 900 parts per billion, which is way, way too high.
So the World Health Organization.
Yeah. And Health Canada's at 280, which is lower, but I mean, really, when you start looking at these numbers, and it's all about long-term exposure. And this is like, the way back when they were trying to prove that tobacco was bad for you, smoking was bad for you. This is a long-term exposure over many years in comparison with all the other contaminants and toxins and other exposures.
Mm-hmm.
And now you got to prove, right, that this one is causing you to be sick, right? Which is almost incredibly impossible in a lot of ways. So we'll go back to the root issue here. And the root issue is that somebody said, oh, why don't we, make a genetically manipulated plant so, it can be exempted, or it won't suffer the same effects of our herbicide and our pesticide, right? That's the idea behind it, right?
Yeah, so it's a profit-driven motive ultimately, right? And then if you go back to, this kind of relates back to the first episode from the season, we talked about sort of governments and regulation in the tech sector, right? So if we touch on this here, because you're kind of mentioning around these acceptable levels of things in our food supply, interestingly enough, and I guess not surprisingly, right? Immediately when the newest administration took hold in the U.S., the first thing they did was pull out of the World Health Organization, right? Which is like mind-boggling when you think about it. And I've heard arguments, oh, this organization is corrupt and this and that. And, I'll be honest, I haven't done enough research into it, but it's sort of troubling it's a troubling move. Like, what's really motivating it? And then you look at who they've put in charge of the health and well-being of people in the U.S. right now, right? This guy who's very much against against vaccines, against all sorts of things, right? And this sort of, it seems like there's going to be this sort of dismantling of this oversight now, right? Back to this idea of deregulation, which some people could argue, okay, fine, you're going to deregulate tech and you're going to, provide more freedom of speech, but this is probably one area where we don't want like more deregulation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the idea behind this, this paired approach to, we're going to make this very nasty chemical to kill off, act like a herbicide and a pesticide. and we're going to make our food, our plants immune to it. Yeah, that's great. So we got these modified fields, right, of GMO product, and of course they cross pollinate, and basically they take over, the fields, right? They from a point of view of if a farmer's beside them and is using natural seeds and such, and what's natural? Well, it's gone through natural. It's gone through our selection, but it hasn't gone through GMO processes, right? Um, the idea being that you got that cross pollination, and now you have Monsanto seed within their corn, and of course Monsanto goes and sues those farmers, right? Because they're using Monsanto product. Like that's the ultimate slap in the face, right? The ultimate level of control by these companies, right? Which is ethically and morally wrong, right? So, for what? 22% improvement?
Yeah.
Like that's a joke, right? This is all a joke in a lot of ways. But nobody's laughing, right? People are suffering because of these. I mean, we just had a kind of epiphany a little while back where they actually linked the massive decline in bee population, right, to these pesticides, right, and these herbicides. It's like, well, that's okay. No, it's not okay, right? We start losing our bees, we start losing the ability for our plants to propagate, and eventually everything dies. It's not our agricultural system can't sustain that. Bird and fish populations, amphibian populations, they're disappearing, right? So we talk about the woolly mouse, and bringing them back. Well, that's too late. We shouldn't. Let's not make them disappear, right? So,
Well, I guess on the flip side, I mean, if we start to see this extinction of bees, is there an option, to sort of in synthetic biology to bring them back, as it were, right?
I just hope that like you said, there's two sides to this coin. One is there's people who are trying to help too, right? They're trying to help reduce the loss of and sustainability of those particular strains, right, of in populations. So I hope that those particular parties will be successful over the big commercial outfits that are just, it's all about money.
Yeah, it
Right?
always comes back to good versus evil.
Yeah. So
But
my bottom line is, when it comes to agriculture, is leave our food alone, right? Stop genetically playing with it, right?
yeah, it's
That won't
interesting.
happen.
It's a lot of it is really, sort of doing things under the guise of, progress or improving things, right? And really, a lot of it is really about control and profit, as opposed to that, right? Like it's like, oh, we're like you described in, those different percentages, really they're not that significant on paper. And what's the end result? We end up with things in our food supply that are hurting us. We end up with huge corporations dominating the food supply space, right? And that really hurts the ability for smaller producers, farmers to produce more naturally grown foods, right? So then you don't end up with a choice as a citizen or as a consumer in terms of what you want, right? It'll sort of reach a logical conclusion of, well, you can only buy what's available, and what's available is under the control of these corporations, and it's all genetically modified in some way or another. And you'll have to drive out into the middle of nowhere to find a fresh strawberry, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, I think, if anything, people, our audience is listening. Hopefully they really do some homework on organic versus, commercial. I actually do the homework on, if you Google it, it's pretty scary stuff. The pesticide remnants that are, within, your grocery food, right, are very high herbicides and pesticides. And a lot of these, when you look at it, everybody likes to talk about the limits, right? Well, at a certain level, you're safe. It's okay. Your body can handle it. But is that true, right? Or is it a constant insult to your body systems, a constant thing? And as soon as you get enough of multiple different, of these insults, it gets to a point where your body cannot handle it at all, right? And you wonder why you're sick. You wonder why you have brain fog. Wonder why you got tremors, or you're feeling really, your system's out of balance, and what have you. And you think, why is your body failing you? Meanwhile, back at the ranch, you are being subjected too, right? And you do have an ability to vote with your dollar and buy organic, and tell these big commercial producers you don't want it anymore,
Yeah,
right?
here's the problem, right? Is that, and you've probably noticed this as well, you go into any grocery store and you wander into the quote unquote organic section, and the costs are always what? They're higher. And
They are.
so the vast majority of people who are, especially in the economy these days, trying to save a buck, trying to make ends meet, they're going for the cheapest option, right? And organic is seen as kind of a luxury, as it were. And then that the end result is that the vast majority of the population are not going to go for it, although it is fairly prevalent. But it almost works into like a class-based system again, right? We've mentioned that type of thing
Yeah,
before, in that
yeah,
really what you end up with is the poor or the less advantaged people financially, in one way or another, are kind of forced into this corner of eating foods that are unhealthy. If you want to eat healthy, it's out of your reach, as it were, right? And even
yeah,
I've seen that mentioned before when um, people talk about, oh, you shouldn't buy pre-processed foods, right? Or you should buy natural foods and cook things yourself. And I've experienced this too, because we really try to buy organic, I guess, when we can, but generally speaking, we try to go with more natural foods and do more cooking. But at the end of the day, you're spending more money. Whereas if you want to go buy really cheap garbage foods, that they're readily accessible, they're very cheap, and they're easy to find. And I know from my earlier days, my entire diet was garbage because I couldn't afford anything more, right? So I was eating cans of Chef Boyardee. Who knows what the heck was in that?
yeah. Well, got to be careful who's owns Chef Boyardee. I think the thing is, people have mysterious ailments, allergies and stuff that pop out of nowhere, and they wonder why, right? And this is your body telling you, I'm sorry, but I can't keep doing this. My filters are full and clogged, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of toxicity in your food, plus toxicity in your environment, toxicity in your air, the air you breathe. Um, it's and in your water, it gets to the point where your body just can't keep up, right? And this is why we get sick, right? In a lot of different situations, this is why we get sick, and you can't. There's no way of proving it that it's one specific, problem, right? And this is where you can do these genetic manipulations on food and get away with it for years and years and years. You can be slowly poisoning the population and get away with it, and nobody can prove it otherwise, you know. And this is the danger, right? Because if you really think about it, if you're going to go play God with food, right, and you're going to make changes, right, how are you going to test and verify that this food is safe over how long a time, right? And from what are you responsible for once you get that out to market, right? And the joke's on us, because I'll tell you, even if it goes back to the original producer, that company A will just fold up, go bankrupt, and they're gone. Meanwhile, the environment is nuked, right?
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
So we'll be right back after a word from the sponsor for this week's episode. So today's Feel Good episode was brought to you by Monsanto.
Yes.
Monsanto, screwing up your life one day at a time.
One day at a time.
Thanks.
So what we do, let's move on
And
to
we're
something
back.
positive. Well, We'll move on some positive stuff.
It
Okay.
actually wasn't too bad. I could probably be a pretty good commercial. If we get some
I think it was
sponsors,
good.
I'll read the ads.
Yeah. Yeah. That's excellent. Well, you are the marketing guy, Jason.
That's right.
So when we think about positive use cases, let's jump into that because otherwise, we'll be talking about this other negative stuff forever. We don't want to do that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so
That's worth
medical,
noting either way. Yeah.
yeah, we just got to be aware, right? And medical advances, right? There's been some interesting work, engineering cells that, you know, they target tumors specifically. Um, the ability to, release, therapeutic agents for diseases. Even the creation, and this is really out there in the sci-fi world, but the creation of artificial organs, right? That's that we're doing all the base work to do that. Now, keep in mind that let's say you need a heart, right?
Hmm.
How long will it take to grow a heart, right? How long will it take to genetically manufacture a heart? And genetically manufacturing means it grows too, right? Um, so there's some interesting advancements there, and I think we need to continue to do that. To because we learn. This is a area of discovery. Also, of course, there's the negative aspect of biological weapons, but we're not going to get into that. Um, then there's nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is a very interesting side because you're talking about you know manipulation at the cellular level, and it goes across all the different areas, including agriculture and medical, right? So just some examples here. Like I said, there's delivery mechanisms to cancer cells and tumors to shrink them or kill off those particular cells. Um, there's delivery mechanisms for vaccines. There's actual bacteria that you can magnetically control, and in order to carry drugs to a certain side of the body. It's interesting. Um, a lot of work being done with nanomaterials, for carbon capture, filtering water, oil spill cleanup. Already I know there's some bacteria that's been found that can actually eat oil, right? Same thing goes with plastic, right? We talk about microplastics in our environment, right? This is another area where we could get into, um, we'll call it hybrid life that will actually eat plastic, right? Um, Another area also we have to think very carefully, what are the effects, right? So if you release an agent like this, right, into the environment, it runs out of food. It eats everything it can find and it runs out of food. What's it going to do next?
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Is it going to die or is it going to adapt to something else? Right?
Well, I think we've got enough plastic on the planet to keep it going for a while. But
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So these things have to be, these kind of questions need to be thought about and answers need to be, prepared and verified, right? Um, and of course, the idea being that some of this technology can also be utilized in military and defense as well. Energy production. We've talked about, you know, the idea of creating, and modifying our atmosphere, and also, with that, you can also produce energy, biofuels, and that kind of thing, utilizing, bacteria and agile cells and everything. So, lots of very interesting work being done in energy production. Um, and I talked a little bit about the idea about magnetic fields, but there's also electrogenics, which is electrical fields being used for therapeutic purposes. Again, these are, creating these specific types of designer type of life forms, these designer cells, and then manipulating them through electric fields to do certain functions. Um, a lot of it is in disease control. Uh, we talked about food production, and of course, uh, where it gets very interesting that you know is in the specialty side of things, right? modifying and updating special types of forms of we'll call it life or quasi-life, um, that support industrial, utilization, right? And to create some exotic materials and all, but also to do conversion of one substance to another, a chemical to a less or more inert safe chemicals, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, so a lot of positive, examples of, where we can find some real progress and real use and value if it's done in a, in a very measured, kind of controlled way. But then again, we're not always known for doing things in a measured and controlled way, right? And then, so that kind of leads me into this, a little bit of an idea around. So all that sounds great, and we've done some level of biological, genetic engineering, what have you, right, over the years. But now, like everything else, it's being accelerated, right, through AI and other technologies,
Yeah,
right? And now, like we covered in a previous episode, you get into like quantum computing and that sort of thing, right? Whereas, interestingly enough, a lot of the progress around quantum computing is around being able to manipulate sort of the building blocks of life, as it were, right? So I wonder where things are going to go when you start intersecting, AI and quantum computing with synthetic biology and genetic engineering, that type of thing, because
yeah,
it's it'll reach a point where it's not just about what we're creating, right? So if we, like, just as an example, if for anybody that hasn't gotten into quantum computing or understand what it's all about, go back and listen to that episode. It'll give you a little bit more context. But if we just combine quantum computing with this idea of synthetic biology or genetic engineering or what have you, great. We could use that processing power to do some really amazing things. But now you throw our good old friend AI into the mix, right? And then you get to the of autonomy and maybe eventually AGI, and now you've got a real petri dish of interesting possibilities, right? Around where are we going to allow either agentic AI or autonomous AI or um, AGI in the future, if we achieve that, are we going to give it access to quantum computing and all of our technologies around synthetic biology or genetic engineering? It's, now we're getting into the science fiction realm, as we always like to do, right? But is it going to start creating, new life forms that it can use and manipulate, or, what's the end state of that going to look like? I wonder, right? So,
well, there's potential, right? There's always potential for that stuff. I mean, bottom line, when you look at it from a as observers point of view, you can see things playing out on different areas, and they merge together. You're not, if you're not that observer, you don't see it happening. But then once it happens, if you're in the mix, it comes at you pretty fast. You never expected it, right? If you had been able to step back and observe, and you would have seen it. I think the idea with this type of technology is that we are messing with, the machines, that we don't necessarily have full understanding of how everything works. I mean, if we
yeah.
did, we'd have command of our own health, right? If we did, we'd be able to, modify and update and change our life throughout the planet. But we don't do that because we don't have an understanding of the versatility of life and the capability and how all our systems work and the many different redundancies that are built in to well, I'll just say mammals, for instance. Never mind, never mind, the plant life, right? So when we get into um, the risks, right? There's lots of risks that we think we really need to be careful of when we move into manipulating what we have today, right? And for instance, I was working with AI on this. I asked AI, what's kind of give me a list of all the different risks and what's what the probability is, right? And it came back with, let me see here,
It said, I don't know what you're talking
seven.
about. There's no risks at all. Like
Yeah,
just,
seven major risks, right? So let's talk about the high probability
only
risks.
7? Come on.
Yeah. So high probability risks are, we'll just call it bad, right? Um, so accidental release of engineered organisms. Where'd that one come from? Anybody say COVID? Okay, so
Or Jurassic Park.
yeah, yeah, thanks. I shouldn't have done that, T-Rex. I don't know what I was thinking. Yeah, so we've got these, I think the most dangerous ones are the little teeny ones. We're just going to introduce this new bacteria or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, in the lab, it really worked well. But like I said before, life adapts, right? So you introduce this new life form into the environment, and it runs out of food. What's it going to do next, right?
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way. Exactly. Yeah. So unintended release means, can I really control containment? Right? And
Yeah, good luck with that.
good luck with that. Yeah. And of course, then, we've got this problem already. And this is with, invasive species, right? You get in North America, we've got invasive species coming in from all different other areas of the world. And they're wreaking havoc on, local species, right? That happens all the time, right? So we're not gonna be contributors to this. We're dealing with natural issues. Never mind the ones we can add up. I mean, we already talked about the idea of this engineered GMO corn and GMO wheat, and how it's basically overcoming all the natural seed. We'll call them repositories, right? So this is a problem, right? That's real. So high probability. Okay. Next one, unintended consequences in human health and environment. Well, okay. Well, I talked a lot about that already. We talked about GMOs,
Yeah.
right? There's been lots of science fiction stories about, gene manipulation, right? And unintended
Mm-hmm.
mutation, right? In animals or humans, right? We're getting into the scary territory. I remember seeing a B movie about a mad doctor on an island and made up all, all these monsters. I was back in the 60s or something, I
Was
think.
that the island of Dr. Moreau
Yeah,
or
yeah,
something
was
like
it?
that?
Yeah, the island
Yeah.
of Dr. Earl, right? And it's like, oh wow, this doctor was incredibly, gifted. Yes, and he made all this, these horrific counterparts to, normal life
Yeah.
forms.
The
Yeah.
Simpsons did a parody on that once. If you look it up, it's they they had all the different characters from The Simpsons as different animals that they were genetically modified into. They all went to the island for a tropical resort vacation. And they all just up as like giraffes and ostriches and what have you, right?
Yes. Yes. So again, guess what? This is high probability for all the reasons we talked about. We talked about GMO. You can't isolate root cause. The we'll call it the monetary desire to move forward with things that are dangerous, and the regulatory systems that aren't, are basically lobbied into inability to act. Um, Suppressing, of or the we'll call the natural ways, the organic ways. They're not, suppressing that whole market. There's lots of bad things around this, and by the way, it's high probability, right? So
Yeah, so you're saying that this COVID thing had like an impact on the planet, like
yeah,
it,
yeah,
like
it's like
people were sort of it altered their lives in some kind of way. I don't
some
remember
way.
that.
No,
Did-
well,
maybe I
yeah,
just wiped out those 2 years from my memory.
yeah. A lot of people want to forget that. Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
the funny thing about this is, COVID, we strongly, you and I strongly suspect, was grown in a lab, modified from existing genes, right, or existing uh, threats. We'll just call them threats. And those threats were, either bacterial or viral, um, experimentation, right? And I'll lump it as those two because there's a lot of there's a lot of bacteriophages out there that can kill us too, not just viruses, right? So yeah, let's tinker with that stuff. Let's see what we can do in the lab, and look, we don't worry about containment. That's never going to get out,
Well,
right?
that was called gain of function research, right? That was the big theory around what they were doing that resulted in COVID, which sort of got out of the lab one way or another, right? It
Hmm.
alters an organism in a way that may enhance the biological functions of gene products. So it's it's interesting that we're pursuing this different type of research, and maybe for good reason, right? But again, we're kind of playing with fire. We're playing God, and then when it unleashes, I mean, look at the spread of COVID throughout the world, right? I
Hmm.
mean, one day it was sort of a blip in the news that was somewhere overseas, and next thing you know, it was oh, there's one case in Canada, and like, oh, there's 10 cases. Oh, the entire country's locked down within a week.
Yeah,
You know, the dramatic spread of that, I think, is what struck me more than anything else.
yeah,
That how quickly it just sort of permeated the population and then continued and continued
yeah,
and continued. Right? It's you wonder if it wasn't something like genetically altered or put together, would it have had that effect? And was that the intention of what was put together? Right? Was it some sort of virus that was genetically modified to spread at a high rate? In other words, to use it, as a some sort of like biological weapon, as it were, or something. But anyway,
yeah,
we're heading back into deep
yeah,
and dark territory here again.
yeah, yeah. But we are talking about risks, and I think it's basically understanding these and then treating these, inventions with appropriate care, right? And the idea was, this was a lockdown lab, but it wasn't, right?
Yeah,
There was procedures in place, but they weren't followed. There were measures that were there to protect, and something happened, right? So, so this is high probability again. Number three is medium probability, and that is ethical and social concerns, and that includes bioethics, inequality, bioweaponization. So when we think about it, it's the all the ethical debates that we're going to have with genetic manipulation of animals and humans, right? And that could eventually cause a lot of conflict. And we're seeing that now, where Europe has specific acceptance criteria on animals per se, and there's a lot of genetic re-engineering being done on cows and dairy, and yeah, that's not allowed in Europe, right? So the idea being that what one country says is okay, another country says no way, right? And wealthier nations monopolize over poor nations, right? And of course, the proliferation of certain um, chemicals that aren't necessarily managed, for instance, or biolife that aren't managed properly or controlled properly in a third world country, for instance. There's lots of concerns around this, and never mind the fact that, and we had our own discussion around, you know, uh, basically genetic editing of embryos, and you know, uh, basically, the next future man, and making a Superman or Superwoman, right? Designer babies, right? Um, so those could be. I mean, there's a lot of strife around going down that road, right? Um, and I don't have the answers. I'm just I'm just bringing up the issue. right?
Yeah, we covered a lot of that in that previous episode last season with Life Finds a Way. So if anybody's interested in going down the rabbit hole on designer babies, as it were, and
Yeah,
yeah, end up doing that.
yeah. So the other medium probability is bioterrorism and weaponization. I don't think I
Oh,
need to
here
get
we
into
go.
that.
Now we're getting into the juicy stuff.
Yeah. I mean, we all know that, we talked about Agent Orange, for instance, in Vietnam. And, there's a lot of chemicals out there. This is just another agent, right? It's a bio agent. So the stand, I think, wasn't the stand about a manipulated virus? I think. I'm not sure. Anyway.
I think so. Yeah, it's been a
Yeah.
long time since I think I read the book of that back in the day, but
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Yeah. The next one is, which is medium, is rogue experimentation, unregulated experimentation. Um, I don't know about you. Do you remember a certain scientist that was going to take the head off a human being and
Yeah.
transplant it to another body? Do you
Yeah,
remember anything?
there was definitely something circling in the news a number of years ago about the idea of doing like head transplants.
Yeah. I mean, this is definitely bioengineering because you have to do a lot of specific, this is like an organ transplant on steroids, right?
Yeah, I know a
it's
few people
crazy.
that could use a head
Head
transplant, but anyway.
transplant. Yeah. So, you've got that, right, where you've got specific doctors and they're not allowed to operate in one country, but they manage to, go over the border, whether that be a mile or two or whatever. And now they're in a different country, right? And they're able to, things are a little looser there legally, right? Speaking. Also, as this type of technology becomes more and more available, like from a point of view of not only the equipment, but the processes, um, then you can actually get into biohacking, right? I don't know, I've seen lots of, great spy shows where, somebody creates a virus and it only kills certain populations, right?
Yeah.
Targeted population, um, you know, uh, poisoning and whatever toxic. So, that's an example. The next thing, this is a medium to low, which is really interesting because I would have put this as high, but I think it was Gemini I asked this. Um, so loss of biodiversity due to engineering cultures, right? So
Hmm.
the idea is that sustainability and ecological stabilization and not affecting the environment or the ecology. I mean that's when they we'll call it the domino effect, right? Um, I would say that this was actually super high, but this was a medium low probability. So strange.
Well, there you go. Maybe Gemini's working on something in the background
Yeah.
and kind of say, well, let's just put this one at a low. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The next one is really like the alien version, right? It grows out of your skin. No, it's a creation of the uncontrollable, the self-replicating, right? So you create something and then it just doesn't stop. And I think we really got to talk a little bit about this story that you started with. This is the perfect lead in to
Yeah.
our woolly mouse.
Yeah, the woolly mouse. That particular story, I think there's a lot of different facets of it that really intrigued me, right? But really you have this company called Colossal, which honestly might be the coolest company name I've ever heard. I wish I started a company called Colossal. But and given their purpose and what have you, it's a pretty apt name, right? I think there's billions of dollars to be made from this idea of kind of de-extinction, but there's definitely a wider scope of things here, right? Basically created something they call the woolly mouse, which if you look up the pictures, I mean, this is an audio only podcast, right? But if you look up the pictures, It's a little mouse that looks like a woolly mammoth, just as you would imagine, right? So I think it's interesting that they chose to do something that just kind of looks really cute. So people are like, "Oh, that's really neat. Like, let's do more of that, right?" If they had brought back like a velociraptor or something, people wouldn't be, so excited about it, right? But it
Yeah.
exhibited, long shaggy hair and a mix of mammoth-like and hair and mutations or what have you, right? So some people have expressed skepticism that it's more about modifying a mouse genetic than a breakthrough in de-extinction, right? But I think they used it to sort of like validate their work, right? Um, and basically, what I found most interesting about it, they touched on AI as well, right? Which we kind of discussed a bit earlier, right? And this combination of access to computing, AI, and synthetic biology, um, they believe might be the most dangerous set of technologies the world has seen. But he also painted this idealistic picture of the future, right? Predicting that these advances will lead to cures for cancer, removing plastic from oceans, which you talked about, the widespread availability of clean water. But this was the interesting quote, and this is kind of a good place to kind of land maybe at the end of it. It said, "We will have true dominion over life." True dominion over life. Now, isn't that like the ultimate power when you want to think about it, right? Where we can eradicate species that are invasive, or we can bring back lost species. And the idea you can engineer plants and everything else that we talked about, right? He went on to talk about, right? But this idea of like dominion over life, which I think is interesting. And then he goes on to talk about, this idea of humanity achieving longevity, escape velocity, right? This, push towards immortality, and that type of thing, right? And it's interesting, but at the same time, is this, like we've talked about, this whole thing, is it going to be used for good or evil? And you have, for example, the U.S. government is heavily investing in colossal. So,
Oh,
what's sort of the end game there, right?
yeah.
It's sort of like everything else. You seem to have, sort of government entities getting involved here. So on the surface, you have this like woolly mouse, but who knows what the end game is here, right? This idea of like dominion over all life, which is, I guess it's a fascinating yet terrifying concept in a way, right?
Yeah, I would say. Yeah, when you start thinking of it like that, where I look at it as just like I look at AI as an augmentation approach. But if you look at it to the next level, it's a humanity replacement approach. What are we doing with this? This synthetic. Uh, we'll call it biological synthesis of new life. What are we going to do next? I mean, the idea of remember the idea of alien. What was we're going to since we found this alien, we're going to take this alien and make our own version of an alien that we can control, and then that's going to be our military, pet, right? And it's so egoic, right, to say that you're going to have control.
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, but at the end of the day, everybody can have their own little woolly mouse as a pet. You can have your own little prehistoric pet, right? Until it sort of gets a mind of its own and goes crazy and takes over the ecosystem and, starts a fur frenzy.
In a land so neat, so bright, a woolly mouse born from the night. Tiny whiskers, soft and slight, engineered to charm the eye. No predator, no great concern, but soon the tides began to turn, multiplying fast as light, for a storm that blocks the sight. Oh, woolly mouse, so small, so sweet, now the earth shakes beneath your feet. Harmless pet with a gentle grin, but chaos blooms as you begin. Under moonlight once tipped their power tower. Scientists once proud and bold now regret the tale they told. From engineered design to spree, a roaring rain, unstoppable spree. A woolly mouse, so small, so sweet. Now the earth shakes beneath your feet. Harmless pet with a gentle grin, but chaos blooms as you begin.
That is good. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.